Today on Eternal Conversations, we have John Cogburn, who is a professor of philosophy at LSU. He teaches primarily in the areas of philosophy of mind, language, and logic. His research interests include realism, anti-realism debates, modality, the computational theory of mind, semantics for vagueness, tacit knowledge, and issues at the intersection of sociology of science and cognitive science. He has written a book called Philosophy Through Video Games and is all around a very open-minded individual. A man who is on an existential quest to get to the bottom of who we are and why we are here. So the way that I know John is whenever I wanted to go to graduate school, I thought I was going to go to graduate school for psychology, but for some reason, I don't know why, I decided to go to graduate school for philosophy. And I randomly chose a philosophy professor, which was Cogburn, and said, hey, can I go sit in on your class? He said, sure. So I went, sat in on the class, and I liked what I saw. And Ishvan Barkley said, stick with Cogburn. He's like, he is the one to stick to. And if you stick with him, you'll be okay through the program. Went through the program, realized that through the process that he was the most open-minded professor, I thought.
Thank you.
Not set in his ways. Did not set cocksureness barriers for himself. I personally am on a lifelong path for knowledge and wisdom, as well as a lifelong spiritual path, both of which have no end, and so can agree and relate to Cogburn. So that's sort of my introductory of who you are and how I met you, and so man, let's talk about your book.
Okay, the newest book is called Garcia and Meditations, which I had helped this guy, Mark Ohm. Did you ever meet Mark Ohm?
No.
I think he was after you. Okay. He was a French PhD student, or a PhD student in French studies, not French himself. And he was taking one of my classes, and at this time, one of my favorite living philosophers, Graham Harman, started blogging about this French philosopher, Tristan Garcia, who's a novelist. I knew about Garcia as a novelist. One of his novels has been translated in English. It's called, Hate, a Love Story? I'm sure I'm getting that wrong. Anyway, it's Tristan Garcia. And Harman was reading him in French and saying how great it was. So Mark Ohm and I started reading, and we thought, hey, maybe we can translate this. And my French is terrible. Mark's is great. And we did. It's a 400-page, doorstop of a book. It took us about a year to translate it. And after doing that, I wanted to write a book about Tristan Garcia. There's a famous book by Husserl called Cartesian Meditations. So Graham Harman suggested Garcia and Meditations. And basically, in the history of analytic and continental philosophy, there was this period where people thought you could not really have knowledge of the world apart from how the world appears to humans. We're just sort of like cut off by the veil of Maya, as spiritualists call it.
Yeah.
And we'll never get to it. And so there was this neo-Kantian period where what does philosophy do? So we do transcendental epistemology. We talk about how the human mind structures things and how the human mind is forced to structure things. Analytic philosophers did that with language. Continental philosophers did that in a more psychological vein. And I'm not putting that down. That was really good stuff. It was in many ways a productive period for philosophy. Great philosophers did that work. But an analytic philosopher in the 1950s, about 30 years into this, people started to question logical positivism, question this prohibition of philosophizing, of doing metaphysics, thinking about the world. And continental philosophers in continental Europe are starting to do the same thing now. And Graham Harman leads this movement called Speculative Realism, and certain French philosophers are doing this now. And Tristan Garcia is one of the key ones. So I saw, as an analytic philosopher, there are commonalities, but I also found out I was learning new things. It wasn't just that these people in France were catching up to what us and the British had done, however many years ago. It was a generally new perspective. And in the history of philosophy, there's sort of two types of arguments that entail that you can't get at the world. One we associate with Berkeley, and Fichte did it. And I won't recite the whole argument, but the sort of case is like this, people call this Berkeley's master argument, try to conceive of something that's unconceived. You can't do it, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you do it, you're conceiving of it.
Yeah.
And so now if you can't even conceive of something, why even think it's possible? If you think possibility entails conceivability, especially unconceivability is going to entail impossibility. But moreover, it's unconceivable. Independent of that, if something's even unconceivable, why think it exists? If I wrote a science fiction story that made no sense, literally made no sense, all right, and asked you to believe that it was true, why should you believe it's true? It doesn't make any sense. Well, if Berkeley's right, we can't conceive of anything that's unconceived. So a world that's radically different from human beings, from our own, what we bring to perception and to our experience of the world, why should we believe this story anymore? So Berkeley argues for empirical idealism. All that exists are thoughts and mind and thinkers. So that's one strain towards what's called correlationism, which is a two-part view. And one part of that correlationism is that we can't have knowledge of, or even stronger, we can't even coherently talk about a world that's radically independent of human minds. The other strain of correlationism comes from Kant. And I want to talk more about that. Kant's view was that when we think about certain totalities, like the totality of space and time, we get into contradictions. So this isn't quite his argument, but it's fine to simplify. You can think about the totality of space. Okay. Then ask yourself, is it finite or infinite? Well, the idea that space is finite for Kant made no sense, because if you got to the end of space, there's just more space after that.
Yeah.
So there's a song, No New Turn to Tell, by not Bauhaus. Some of the members of Bauhaus, the guitarist, was in this band. Anyway, forgetting the name of the band. Love and Rockets. But the first line is, you can't go against nature, because when you go against nature, well, that's just nature too. It's the first line of the song. You can't get to the end of space, because when you get to the end of space, that's just space too. So space must be infinite.
Yeah.
Well, Kant realized...
Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson said recently that, so we used to think that there was only one planet, ours. We used to think, and then we learned, no, there's multiple planets. We used to only think that there was one sun, ours. That's it. And then at some point we realized that's just one out of, billions or trillions of suns out there. We used to think that there was only one solar system, ours. And then we surpassed that to find out that there are billions or trillions of solar systems out there. We used to think that there was only one galaxy, ours.
Yeah. We
surpassed that, and there are billions of hundreds of billions of galaxies that we know of. So if all that all follows, then
now we think there's one universe.
Why should we think that there's only one universe?
Yeah.
Instead, there should be, according to that, multiple universes. Yeah. So the multiverse.
But even, so that's, and this is one of the lessons I want to get to. Every time you postulate a totality, in thinking of that totality, you think beyond that totality. That's what deGrasse. And I think Kant had this insight. And so finite space makes no sense. So does infinite space make sense? And he thought that made no sense either.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to talk about in a bit. But the response to that making no sense for Kant was correlationism. Just like for Berkeley, we're not going to think about an unconceived world. All we can think or talk about is this. For Kant, we can't have any knowledge of, of a world independent of what our mind brings to interpreting the world. As far as totalities, he seems to suggest something stronger, that it makes no sense to talk about these absolute totalities. But if you think we can't have knowledge of the way the world is in itself independent from humans, he thought we were safe, because we'll never talk about a totality. There's only a potential infinity. We don't know what absolute space is. All we know is we can keep getting more and more and more. Same with time. We can imagine going backwards in time further and further, but we never get to infinity. And so this sort of Kantian lesson was, Kantians took it in the 19th century under Hegel. It kind of, people tried to reject it. But then the Back to Kant movement in Germany in the early 20th century, Marburg School Neo-Kantianism, which led to logical positivism and analytic philosophy once the Nazis threw the logical positivists out, and Southwest School Neo-Kantianism, Windelband and Rickard, which were Heidegger's teachers, but Heidegger was a Nazi himself. He didn't get thrown out. And so his brand of Neo-Kantianism became phenomenology. Speculative realism is an attempt to, in continental philosophy, to get beyond correlationism. Can we deny one or both of these things? The Berkeleyan idea that we can't conceive of or talk about a reality independent of our own, of something that's been colored by our own conceptual resources radically, and the Kantian line, can we talk about totalities? And these are two different things. The French philosopher Meillassoux, he says, let's get rid of the Kantian things. Let's go with Hegel and talk about totalities. But he's with Berkeley. So for Meillassoux, he wants, as a speculative realist, we can speculate about totality, but that totality is a totality of correlates, of human world correlates. Graham Harman, on the other hand, does just the opposite. He is a philosopher of finitude, but he thinks these radical finitudes we know can be independent of us, radically independent of human cognition. What's interesting about Tristan Garcia is that the way I interpret him in my book is he gets rid of both of these. Now I want to get a little more granular and tell you a story. Where my research has gone with this is taking the anti-Kantian line more seriously. So I have a friend who I won't name who told me about a mystical experience that he had. And I'm going to botch this a little bit because I didn't have the experience. I can't help but botch it, right? I didn't have the experience. So the experience was of a sort of glowing electric or something greenish orb, kind of. And the orb was being and becoming. And the orb talked to him. The orb said, "Don't be cancerous," which is profound wisdom that we all should follow and think about. And I thought about that a lot in the last few years after my friend told me that. I mean, a lot. And there's two things that are weird about it. And I've looked into other mystical experiences that people have. And you find both of these weird things. One, can I really understand it given that I haven't had that experience or that kind of experience? Mystics often say, they will tell you, I cannot put this in words. I cannot describe what happened. And this is in every religion, every wisdom tradition. There are people who say this. We need to listen to this, right? This isn't just something Christians are saying or Muslims are saying or Anabaptists were saying.
Or some hippie dude from the 60s.
Yeah, no. This goes back to whenever humans started recording what humans are saying.
Yeah.
These profound experiences that you can't put into words.
All throughout history, all throughout different religions.
Yeah. There's always, when Joseph Campbell talks about this once, that he said, I don't know if this is true, but every 10 years, there's like a World Congress of Religions. I think they have it in Hawaii maybe, or they did it this one time. And the theologians have a blast. They argue with each other about the philosophy. The contemplatives, the monks, they just have fun with each other, right? Because the differences that we articulate in language and how you want to articulate the differences themselves. I mean, it's the elephant metaphor. Oh, I'm feeling the trunk. You're feeling the whatever, the ears. Or maybe it's something different. I don't know. But somehow people have had this experience that they can't put in words. These differences seem less significant. They seem to be pictures of something and maybe of the same thing. And what we're trying to do is put something in words that really can't be put into words. If you do that, it's gonna filter into cultures, which we're cultural creatures, and language, we're linguistic creatures, in these radically different ways. But maybe the experience itself is something the same. But philosophically, this is a problem because we use language in philosophy. So for me to philosophize about my friend's experience is to, in a way, do what the theologians are doing. And luckily the monks don't hate the theologians. Maybe they should, because we're doing violence to their reality. I don't know. Or maybe those of us doing philosophy and theologians need to listen to the monks more and try to learn from that wisdom. But again, we're putting it back in words. So that's the first thing. The paradox of drawing a limit to what can be said. That's a totality. Remember Kant and the totality of time? But unlike the Kantian says, like, I'm going to stay safely on this side. Most mystics, they tell you that there's a limit and you can't get past it, but they walk right over that limit and they continue to talk to you. And something's communicated. What's communicated is different from what you would communicate if you're inside that limit. So that's very philosophically interesting. And it goes back to the Kantian strain of correlationism. If you take mystics seriously, you're not going to be a correlationist in that way. The other thing, and this is maybe the same thing about what my friend said, is this green orb was being and becoming. Well, what else is there? Nothingness? What is nothingness? Is nothingness something we can talk about that all day, but we won't. It's being and becoming. It's a totality. It's not just a totality, it is totality. Yet, it spoke to my friend. So my friend, in having this experience, the totality that he was part of, because he's being, he's becoming, right? He was also separate from. And I think it's the same logic as the logic of saying what can't be said. In the mystical experience, you're separate from the totality that you're part of. So you both are and aren't that totality. And that's how they're described. Now, when we philosophize, what do we want to say about that? And there are a couple things that I'll get to in a bit, but I want to say, I think this, again, this isn't just some hippie, Let's look at Buddhism and Christianity, just to take two examples. We can find this in any mystical tradition. One of the central paradoxes of lots of strains of Buddhism is that a bodhisattva. Let's start even before you're a bodhisattva. If you desire enlightenment, you won't be enlightened because you're still craving something. The desire for wisdom, if you're craving it, again, we put it in language, we chop and dice, it becomes an instrument of control again. All right? You want to be more enlightened than somebody else. The desire for goodness is like that too. It's fine to want to be good, but the desire to be good becomes a desire to be better. And when you're desiring to be better, you're not going to be good. So the bodhisattva maybe initially desired enlightenment, but when they're really getting it, they're beyond even the desire to be enlightened. They're beyond everything. They're attaining nirvana. They're, it's maybe Alan Watts says this, or maybe this is in the Diamond Sutra, a drop of water going into the ocean, and they're attaining this unity with the green sphere or whatever, just becoming. But somehow the bodhisattva, beyond all desire, is still witness to the suffering in the world. And the bodhisattva doesn't dissipate. The bodhisattva then becomes a saint and alleviates suffering. But the bodhisattva doesn't desire to alleviate suffering. The bodhisattva is beyond desire, but still does it. In Taoism, Wu Wei, I don't know how to say it, the principle of action without action, right? It's the same thing. And so this is a contradictory principle. I think it's another case where you have a totality that you've transcended, but in transcending the totality, in some sense, it's no longer totality because you're outside of it. But you're still within the totality because it is a totality. And so the totality of desire, they're outside of it, but they still desire to alleviate suffering. It's that being paradoxical, that's as important as the Trinity in Christianity. It wouldn't be the same thing if it was just, take heroin and don't feel anything. It's not. There's this paradox. Christianity is laced with this. I mean, Jesus is on the cross and he says, forgive them for they don't know what they've done. He also says, was it Eli Eli Lama Sabachthani? What is that? He's begging God to not do this to him. You know, to just not do this. He's just begging, and he's being tortured to death. And he just breaks down and begs. That's weird. Jesus says God, so is he begging himself? Right? And you know, it's very important if you study the history of Christianity. It's very important for ethical and political reasons, not just weird philosophical reasons, to not think that Jesus is just a person, not think that Jesus is just a God. But he can't be both, yet there's the affirmation that he is. You find this with the kingdom of heaven. What is the kingdom of heaven? Well, it's at hand. That means it's here. It's in this room. If anyone's listening or it's there, out, it's that this is it. This is the kingdom of heaven, and rejoice. You know, like a joyful noise. But nobody sincerely becomes religious or philosophical in a sincere way if they don't profoundly feel that something is off kilter in reality, right? We compare the reality that we're in with something better, at least, or maybe with a sense of perfection, right? So you wouldn't have the realization that the kingdom of heaven is at hand if you didn't initially realize that this wasn't the kingdom of heaven and it's not at hand, right? And there's ways that this is reconciled in the tradition. People talk about thin places where you sort of feel something different. We've all had this when you're taking a walk in the sunshine and you feel this is the totality and you feel connected to the totality. You feel that things are, despite the appearances early, things are as they should be. And that's an experience of grace. Leonard Cohen likens it to one ski going down a mountain. He says you want to be that. He says you wake up in the morning and you're not that ski, just go back to bed. That's what he wants to do. So, you know, and some people say, well, it's at the end of history. Hegel seemed to make this mistake. You know, there's an eschatology, and at the end of history, the kingdom of heaven will be realized on earth. And that's important. We want to make the world better than it is. But there's also something to the paradox, you know, of a limit and seeing beyond that limit, and that no longer being the totality once you're beyond it. But nonetheless, it still is a totality in some sense. And so, and maybe I'm being a little playing fast and loose. So I think that what seems like dry philosophy, the correlationism, you know, are we stuck in this Kantian prison where we cannot, you know, I mean, think of how arrogant that is. The world is a stain. I cannot get out of the stain that my mind puts off the world. I'm just stuck in it. Now, if you love yourself, that's great, right? But if you have that religious or philosophical temperament, and you sense that something's seriously off kilter, like metaphysically, the Kantian prison, you see that, you know, what did Marx say about religion? That after he says it's the opiate of the masses, he says it's flowers on the chains of our oppression, right? That's what philosophical correlationism or Kantianism, and I think Kant's the greatest philosopher ever, but still, I think Kantianism is flowers on the chains of your oppression.
The way that I like to look at it is that one of my mystical experiences was that there is eternity in every moment, that all of eternity is occurring like right now. All of the processes of the universe, there is the past has vanished, the future only exists in thought, therefore the present, like all of eternity is occurring now in this moment. There's divinity in every particle, that there is all matter is simply energy condensed to a slow vibration. So all matter is energy, so that, and like this table is really hard. I can't put my finger through it. I can't put my hand through it because it is a condensed energy moving with very fast vibrations, moving so fast that I can't put my hand through it. But so that there's a life force, an energy life force in all matter and all air and all divinity in every particle of all that exists, but that all is one organism. So I had the revelation that all is one organism, which may be an answer to how can there be something that exists that you can't know about, but that you can know about it, because then it contradicts itself. But because if all is one organism, then we are a part of the organism, but we're a part of the organism that is performing a role or performing some sort of task that is one with that organism. So say our body is like a planet. We host millions and billions of bacteria and creatures that crawl on our skin. There are millions and billions of...
I hope they're happy. It'd be sad if they're miserable,
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be good to be like a host of a bunch of happy little bacteria?
Yeah, super
doing
happy.
their thing, just bliss.
But they're all interdependent. And our gut flora, has billions of bacteria that help us. Our eyeballs, eyelashes, skin, hair, nails, we're a host to billions of bacteria. We are almost like an advanced form of bacteria on the earth. The way that I like to see it is that the earth is Mother Gaia. The earth is an organism, and that we are supposed to be existing on this earth in order to maintain the earth. We're supposed to be the maintainers of the earth, yet we've become a virus. And so if the earth is an organism and the solar system is sort of like a molecule, and the universe is sort of like I guess what would be bigger than a molecule? Like
a compound? I don't know.
A compound or a group of molecules, maybe. And so the universe is also, it's just bigger than that. And then if there's a multiverse, and maybe that multiverse is all one atom, is a part of one atom on a rock of a sandy shore somewhere. And so I guess I'm trying to explain that if all is one organism and we are a part of that organism, it's like we are a part of what do you call the creatures that eat your skin or maintain your skin? So if we are an organism, and if all is one organism, not that that makes everything interconnected. Nothing is separate, seemingly separate, but all one, because I'm trying to think of how to sew this together.
I mean, it's difficult, and it gets back to the problem of correlationism, because we have to talk about things like this, we have to use what we know, right?
Yeah.
So we know some biology, and are we using these metaphors? There's a from your perspective, which I hope is true. I mean, I don't think I'm as advanced spiritually. I think my daughter is, actually, but I'm not. Audrey, pretty soon after when we buried our cat, she was like 3 or 4, and Thomas was like 6 or 7. They were really sad. So we said some prayers and had a Christian funeral a Presbyterian funeral for our cat. And Tom was just like, "Dad, do cats go to heaven?" And I said, I don't know. I don't know. I hope they do. I hope that people go to heaven, but I don't know. And Audrey's like 3 or 4 at the time. She said, "No, you're both wrong." Like, what? They're reborn as babies, just like people.
Wow.
It's like, what?
Wow.
When you die, you go to heaven for a little while, then you're reborn as a baby. And I said, "What do you think Benji will be reborn as?" And I forget. She had some theory about what kind of... But she had the idea that you could cross species, too. You wouldn't just be reborn as a... And I never told her anything like that. And she also was a vegetarian from very young, too. So.
Wow.
But anyway, I'm not there. So philosophically, I'm trying to make sense of what you're saying.
Yeah. Some Hindus believe that little kids, like when you're born, it's fresh in your memory, reincarnation and who you were, who your previous life was, or your million previous lives where it's fresh in your mind, and you're closer to God or being or the Tao or whatever you want to call it. So so you're and you can see more in tune with the afterlife and ghosts, and that at some point after like 3 or 4 years old, we just seem to lose that.
Yeah,
we forget until we die, and then we're reminded, and then when we're born, we still have that memory until like 3 or 4 years old.
And I guess enlightenment is recovering that when you're. I mean, the Hinduism's interesting because with this issue of like my friend who told me about the experience and what I can understand of it, right? And I would get back to the universe as an organism too, but the reason the Bhagavad Gita was written, my understanding, is that all these people in classical Hinduism, which I don't think they referred to it as Hinduism at the time, but the people in the Indian subcontinent, they would just like drop what they're doing and walk into the woods and just meditate and just try to get this knowledge of the unity of all things. That's the knowledge of Brahman or Atman, or that's the knowledge of what you were articulating with the metaphor, or not a metaphor, I don't know, of organism, the philosophy of organism. And it supposedly it was a little problematic because, I don't know, people need to do their jobs, I guess, but if everybody's just walking into the woods, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And so, at the end of the
stuff has to get done too.
Yeah. That's at the end of the Bhagavad Gita, the guy, the general doesn't want to kill his cousins, and he doesn't want to lead the chariot charge. And the guy driving his chariot turns out to be Krishna, and Krishna's like, you've got to do your job while you're here. My understanding is that's interpreted as a way you can do your job while you're here and still attain that insight. It's still the case in Hinduism that often when your kids are out, you have these phases of life. When your kids are out of the household, then you become much more contemplative. But there's a proper way to raise a child or to work a job and still pursue this experience of oneness or this realization. But here's in terms of what we've been talking about, it's interesting. I can read these books like the Upanishads or the philosopher Schopenhauer, who read the Upanishads and comes up with a system very similar. And I know that you're into Nietzsche, so Nietzsche was Schopenhauer's great disciple. I can read that and agree with that intellectually, but according to the rules of mystical experience, again, in all cultures, it's still not the same if I haven't had the experience myself. So in the Yoga Sutra by Patanjali, it's interesting. I'm Presbyterian, and we have this idea of grace. It's Johnny Cash religion. It's good country music religion. It's 3 G's: guilt, grace, gratitude, right? But that moment of grace, that experience of grace in yoga, in classical Indian philosophy of yoga, and in Presbyterianism, is not something that you earn. It's a gift. And so Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, I don't know what years, says in Sanskrit, you don't. It's a paradox again. You can prepare yourself, but you can't earn it. It's always a gift, but that gift is an experience. And so maybe reading Schopenhauer or the Upanishads or something is preparing you, but still the experience of it. So there's something about the experience of the realization of unity that's different from the way we articulate it, whether it's in terms of organism or if we're speaking Sanskrit or something. And we can articulate it and intellectually agree with it, but somehow still not realize it. And that for me, that distinction is I think, of fundamental philosophical importance. And it goes back to this issue of correlationism. We seem to be stuck in language. How do we get out of it? And the great philosophers I like to study, like Garcia and Graham Harman, that's their problem space, and they have answers to how we can get out of it. I mean, I love what you're saying about organism, and that's a Hegelian strain where I think Joe Josiah Royce called that a philosophy of organism, and you're doing different things with it, but I don't know. I mean, what I go back to is
I want to write a book about it one day, but the thing is that it coincides with science perfectly. Like, I want to be able to prove there's eternity in every moment. There's divinity in every particle, and that all is one organism. And I want to prove it scientifically. So I want it to be a mystical, metaphysical, scientific book, because that all is one organism. I bet, I don't know how yet. Like I was having a trouble talking about it a minute ago, because I know it, and I know it's like this huge, super huge, big picture. But it's going to take me years to like break it down, to like figure out, all right, how is that? Why is that?
Is this series of podcasts in a way is working through that too, I think.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's you want to prove it, right? But what is a proof? A proof is, you've seen the argument clinic with Monty Python. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Okay, well, I'm going to botch it, so I won't try to. The guy's like paying for an argument, and when he goes and he pays to go in the argument clinic, the other character just negates everything he says. He just says, no, it's not. That's not true. No, it's not. And then the one character, these are all philosophy majors, the guys at Monty Python, he explains, no, this is what an argument is. And he gives the thing you would learn in like one of the philosophy classes that we've taught. You know, it's a series of propositions that are connected with deductive or inductive steps, you know, where the premises provide support for the conclusion. If it's deductively valid, it's not logically possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. If it's inductively valid, the truth of the premises support the truth of the conclusion, and soundness is when it's valid plus the premises are true. Okay. And so he explains that, and of course the other guy just says, no, it's not. Because it's very, so look it up on YouTube, anyone's, the argument clinic. But so a proof, if you prove this, again, that's still going to be words, right? And when you know, could someone read those words and agree to them, have the belief, but still not realize it in a sense.
Yeah.
And in classical Hinduism, you have to do the practice, the meditation, or in, you know, Presbyterians are weird. They're weird Christians because they're theologically very liberal, right? But they're liturgically incredibly conservative. You know, our church service, there's none of this. I mean, I love acoustic guitar, but I don't want it in the church service. It's very conservative, and the liturgical conservatism is that, like, look, these rituals evolved for a reason to do something to us, right? And so it's weird to think of a book that's propositions. It's attempting to provide evidence for some conclusions, so you want people to assent to them, but you also want them to understand the propositions. There's a thought experiment in philosophy called true temp. And true temp is this poor guy who has a thermometer put in his brain, and it's wired up in his brain the right time that, you know, any ambient temperature, he can say the temperature. Philosophers are actually terrible on temperature. It's much more complicated. You find a lot of philosophy papers that temperature is mean kinetic energy, and Mark Wilson proved it's not. There's all sorts of other things. But anyway, but let's assume he can do this. And the thought is like, oh, he's very reliable, but he doesn't really know what temperature is. He's just like a parrot, just talking, because the thing in his mind is programming him. And I think most philosophers misunderstand that. It's not a problem with reliability as a theory of justification, because they want to say true temp's not justified. He's justified. What he doesn't have is he doesn't grasp the meaning of what he's saying. He doesn't understand. So knowledge is justified true belief. The problem with true temp is he doesn't have the belief, right? And so I think when you look at, again, the Hinduism, it's clear there. It's not enough to just read the Rig Veda and the Upanishads or, you know, whatever. You have to do the work. You have to meditate. You have to you have to do good works. You have to be charitable. You have to, and it's a spiritual exercise that gives you this other kind of knowledge. So,
well, I guess
so. You write your book and you prove this, but you've got to do more than just provide evidence for this. It's got to get a reader to understand it.
Yeah.
But maybe that's more than just a book can do. So the book would be part of.
Well, I guess the book, or a lot of, or some religions such as Buddhism, they're simply, like in the book, something like that. I can just sort of lead the reader along to understand the path, which is unending, which would be a lifelong path. But it's sort of like an infinite path, like the spiritual path to me.
Okay, can I ask you a question? Or
Okay.
if you want to finish that sentence, I got a question though.
Okay.
Okay, because that's very interesting, the unending path. Can you rearticulate the three premises, or not theorems or conclusions or axioms that you initially had? And I
Okay.
want to think through the path being unending in terms of those axioms, if there's a connection. So
Okay.
what? Divinity,
So there's eternity in every moment.
eternity, beautiful.
There's divinity in every particle. And I use moment because it doesn't have to do with time. Because time is, the measurement of time is a human construction. And particle because instead of saying in every atom or every molecule, like every particle, but there's eternity in every moment, divinity in every particle, and that all is one organism.
Eternity in every moment, divinity in every particle, and all is one organism. Okay, so that's our picture. It's beautiful. There's Aquinas is God, is truth, goodness, and beauty. So we've got some of divinity right there, and this. Okay, is there a connection between that picture of totality and the idea that the path is unending? Because why can't I just say, okay, I agree with you,
Well,
and I'm not challenging you like this is a
no, no, no.
problem thing you're saying. I'm interested, and
Yeah,
because I think
yeah.
there is a connection.
I'm trying to work this out too, Well, I guess to say that there's eternity in every moment is a final statement. But so to claim or show that there's eternity occurring in every moment is a statement put into words, but at the same time it's open because there is no certain specific time and place. There's no specific space and time marker for it.
Yeah.
And that there's divinity in every particle. That's a definite statement, but I'm not referring to it being at any one particular time and place. And that all is one organism is definite, but
I mean, is it this? The realization is that there's eternity at any moment, but we articulate that finitely. We articulate that as we're becoming, and the articulation itself is part of becoming, not this eternal being. And that's why the path has to be endless, because back to Christianity, you have, with Aquinas, it's weird because God created the world. But God created time. But how could God create time? Because creation is something that happens in time. So time itself can't be created. And what traditional theologians do to get out of that is say that, God is logically prior to the universe, not temporally prior. Okay, but creation is not a logical act. Creation's a temporal act. So that doesn't help me at all. And I think so that's a philosophical problem that we could play with, but I think there's a deeper thing in terms of what you're saying too. The spiritual realization, or in these moments of grace, we see the connectedness and eternity and divinity. Again, to get back to what we started with, when you have that realization, you're both inside of it and outside of it. You're outside of that world of becoming, because you see the world of becoming, all the moments of time as eternal, right? But then, right now, when we're talking about this, clearly we're in time. So when you talk about the path, you're talking about eternity and non-eternity at the same time, and maybe that's why the path itself has to be unending. It's a strange thing. It's we are behind the veil of Maya, but once we appreciate it as a veil of Maya, it's no longer the veil of Maya.
I guess
Because to see a limit is to go beyond the limit.
I guess that's why I've been getting into Taoism in the last few years too, because like the symbol of the yin yang, the Tao symbol of the yin yang. So truth seems contradictory, and because truth, if there's such thing as truth beyond what humans have constructed, then it would contain contradictory information in itself. Like, so say black, the color black wouldn't make sense without white. Something existing wouldn't make sense without nothing. So that we think that space is nothingness, like the distance between the earth and the sun, that space is nothing. But it's very important, because without that nothingness, there couldn't be something existing within that nothingness. And these are all from the Tao Te Ching, pretty much. And that what would good if there's only good and then no evil? Good wouldn't make sense. If there was only evil, good wouldn't make sense. So contradictions are necessary in order for truth to exist in the first place.
And what's the first sentence of the Tao Te Ching?
That which can be told cannot. The Tao which can be told is not the eternal Tao.
Yeah, or the eternal Tao cannot be spoken. Yeah, and that's exactly what we're talking about. So you're absolutely right. So what you're doing here is you're putting it in to words. At the end of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, Wittgenstein says, there is indeed the mystical, or wovon man kann nicht sprechen, darüber muss man schweigen. Whereof man cannot speak, thereof must man remain silent, or must one remain silent. But in the whole book, he admits that, okay, then he shouldn't have said everything he said in articulating his own philosophy, drawing the limits of meaningfulness. And he says at the end, and it's a cop-out, but we can't but cop-out. He says, well, you have to use these propositions like a ladder. Oh, well, one of those propositions is there is indeed the mystical. The mystical shows itself. So the mystical he's talking about isn't the mystical that's showing itself. But how can he tell us about the mystical that's showing itself if it's not the same? And he says at the end, you have to use these propositions like a ladder that you kick away, and then you could see the world aright. And so it's very Taoist, right?
Yeah, definitely so. And I think because only in the last 5 years, I started getting into Taoism, Alan Watson Taoism and all that after graduate school, because like Gary and Parker were telling me, man, you really need to check this out. This is some good stuff, Alan Watson and all that. I'm like, yeah, I'll get to it. And I'm actually glad that I didn't get to it until after graduate school, because if I had gotten into it during that time, I wouldn't have been able to write my thesis.
I know.
Because I'm like,
Yeah.
So it seems like Western philosophy doesn't like to really talk much about Eastern philosophy. Most philosophy professors, because there's nothing to argue about.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like a closed system, because it's combining the two contradictions into one.
And there's some exceptions, and so I mentioned Quentin Meillassoux and Graham Harman, who both disagreed in various ways with correlationism, and Tristan Garcia, who disagrees with both. The next most important philosopher is Graham Priest, who's written this great book called. He's written lots of great books. One of them's called. And I'm just being crazy not thinking about it. I can see the book in my head. And Beyond the Limits of Thought. Beyond the Limits of Thought. And Priest actually, he's interested in Asian philosophy. And he tells a guerrilla history of philosophy in terms of philosophers thinking about limits, totalities, but in articulating the limits and prohibitions going beyond those limits, they themselves break their own prohibition, because to articulate the limit is to go beyond the limit.
Yeah.
Or to go, whether that's knowability or thinkability or speakability or whatever. And he tells a whole history of philosophy. Well, Priest's position with respect to these, and he shows that Bertrand Russell's paradox, which we could talk about later if you want. Russell's paradox, in a sense, is a key paradox in allowing you to articulate this history and understand all these things. And a lot of my research in the book, and the next book I'm writing on Graham Harman, utilizes some of priest's understanding. But priest's own view is that these are true contradictions. So against the Western logical tradition going from Aristotle, and Priest is a hell of a logician himself, but he gives up the law of non-contradiction. And so in these limit contradictions, both sides are true. There is the limit, and the limit's been gone beyond. Graham Harman, in my next book, I'm looking at Harman's work. He has an interestingly different take on this. So we've read Plato. If you guys haven't, there's an interesting thing that happens in Plato. This generic dialogue, Socrates comes into the marketplace and he asks like a general what bravery is, or he asks some supposed expert to define their key concepts. And they do a bad job, and he embarrasses them by giving counterexamples. But they never really get... a Plato scholar is going to throttle me for saying that, but for the most part, they never get, maybe never, any answers. Right? You never come up with the definition of bravery or the fine or goodness or whatever. It always fails. And the way Harman interprets that is Plato was actually trying to teach us, or maybe Socrates was trying to teach us, that the point of philosophy isn't knowledge, it's wisdom. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is, this isn't Aristotle's definition of wisdom, but just intuitively wisdom is a wise person knows how to conduct themselves. You know, if you need advice, or you think you need advice, but you really need something else, they can intuit the correct thing to do. Right? And so philosophy, and wisdom applies to doing theory. There's a lot of creativity if you're doing science, right? How do I interpret these results? You can't get a computer program to do that. I mean, these things are probably not computable. It involves a sort of creativity, this skillful coping in the world, and what does the world afford, and what are the right affordances that the world presents to you that you should follow? And the thought is that dialectics, Socratic dialectics, trying to hone our concepts and failing will actually make you better in employing them, and maybe better in other ways in your life. And so for Harman, if the point of philosophy of wisdom, what do we say about these limit contradictions? And I would have to go through limit contradictions. Maybe we could talk about it. I go through to my book quite a bit. Harman actually, in Garcia, you could derive a limit contradiction or an enclosure paradox with respect to metaphysical explanation. You know what? I'm gonna drink some water and tell you this real quick because it's interesting.
Okay.
And it does relate to the spiritual stuff we're talking about. Though Grand Priest might be horrified if you ever heard me say that. So for Harman, there's two kinds of explanation paradigmatically. One he calls overmining, and one he calls undermining. And they're both types of reduction. So undermining explanations are where, I'm simplifying this quite a bit, where so an example of an undermining explanation would be, you want to understand what this table is. Well, the way to understand it is to understand the parts of the table. The very small parts. And if you do that enough, you get the science of, of the molecules, of substances, and if you do that enough, you might think that's what the table really is. It's just atoms bouncing around in the void, or whatever is below that level, because you can undermine that, and you get subatomic particles, and you get fields, and that's what reality is. And this is just sort of doesn't really exist, or it's an illusion or something. And so that's a kind of a limit of reduction. Well,
only vibrations.
Yeah.
Reality can be boiled down to pure vibrations. That's it.
Yeah, and there's another kind of, and so a lot of continental philosophers think, oh, we're against reductions and we're against that. And Harman says, wait a minute, you're not. You're replacing one kind of reduction with another, overmining. So like if I'm doing sociology of science, well, how did the scientists come up with this theory? Well, you can look at certain things in society that made this seem like a plausible thing to believe, and there's always more options that are being thrown out. So why did we start believing in the computational theory of mind? I wish Berkeley was here because he could argue with me about this, but well, that happened after World War II. In World War II, the United States got P.T. Barnum, right? Because Barnum knew how to keep people fed on the road, right? And the logistical challenge of getting all these troops over was just unmanageable. And we tried to come up with the science of that too. Academics looked into it. We invented management theory. So you could know, Barnum was a genius and his people were, but this idea that you could have no expertise in anything but still be an expert with that expertise, that's what a manager is. You don't have to know about engineering to manage an engineering company. It's not true, but that's the religion or ideology of our age, ideology in the Marxist sense of our age. So let's say you buy that story. I want to write a book about that someday, actually. You buy that story and you think, well, we just picked this scientific theory because society was at a certain way where it makes, it serves certain interests for people to believe this. And, so I don't know, what does P.T. Barnum have to do with that? Okay, so management theory is the idea that there's people at the top of the chain that sort of direct everything because they're experts in direction. That's the metaphor for the human mind, then. The brain is like this dictator at the top who controls everything you do in these perfectly rule general way. So the classical picture of artificial intelligence is that there were domain general learning algorithms. So it's the same algorithm whether it's riding a bike, fundamentally, or learning to cook, or learning to play a musical instrument, or anything. It's the same procedure, right? Well, you would only think that about the mind in a culture that worships the manager. Everyone should read Kurt Vonnegut on management theory, especially his first book, Player Piano, which is a wonderful send-up. He saw in 1950 what our society was becoming. So the idea is we've got this metaphysics of what the human mind is. It's a central processing unit running domain general algorithms. But what preceded that was a mode of social organization that privileged that. And it's not a very good mode of social organization. And in fact, this is what Eastman and I would maybe argue about. It's not a very good philosophy of mind. So, but let's say you thought that all theory is like that. Okay. Well, what are you doing now? You're explaining the table in terms of the table's relation to other things, thinkers that think about the table, right? And that may not be the best example, but there are lots of examples in philosophy that explain things relationally, right? I mean, even for early Marx, what a human being is just a node in a set of relations. And Harman's not against undermining and overmining. This is how we explain things, right? You explain the table. If you want to build a table factory, you better know the engineering and physics of a table, and you better know about the physics parts. If you want to know about a human being, you need to do sociology and understand, or an ecosystem. Or if you're right and the universe is an organism, you need overmining as well for planets and stuff like that. So, but Harman says he thinks that overmining and undermining, he sees them as eliminatory. Again, what you said, there's just vibrations. Or in continental philosophy with correlationism, back to it, we can't talk about reality as itself. All we can talk about is things' relations to the human mind. Well, that's an overmining relation. The table isn't the real table. What there is human perceptions of a table or human thoughts of tableness. And usually they come together. Like some people who would believe the vibrations theory, well, what about the table? Well, that's how the human mind cuts up the vibrations, right? Which I don't like. That's an act of violence on the world that the human mind is doing. I'm not going to be happy about that. I would like to respect the table's autonomy as a table. And that's Harman's fundamental insight. And so Harman says what he calls object-oriented ontology, what it is to be an object is to resist undermining and overmining. The table has an autonomy, and it's a constraint on philosophy to respect that autonomy. Now, here's the paradox. And Harman has this wonderful philosophy that, again, it accepts Kantian finitude but rejects Berkeleyan idealism. When you look at Harman's philosophy, though, it's very paradoxical because it's explaining tables such that tables can do that. But at the same time, he's doing it in terms of metaphysical posits about the structure of the table and the way the table is related to other things. So Harman himself, in giving a philosophy to reject undermining and overmining, has to undermine and overmine himself. Not overmine himself, he himself has to undermine and overmine. And so you get yet another, if you plot this out, it's an enclosure paradox, just like Russell's paradox, just like my friend with the green sphere, saying what can't be said, being outside of the totality that he himself is a part of. And so you get the same kind of enclosure paradox.
But isn't it just simply because the only way that we as human beings, so far at this point in evolution, can convey ideas is through language, whether spoken or written, and it depends on when and where you're born, or where you're born. Culture is your operating system.
Yeah.
Just like, if you're in the United States, you're going to be influenced by Christianity more likely.
And there's a sense.
And the English language, and that, so like the German language, there's so many more nuances as far as I understand in the English language. And that Chinese is just a symbol that represents a metaphor. It's a symbol that represents a metaphor or a thought. And
it couldn't be otherwise. And that's the paradox again. I mean, what happened in the 60s that was bad is they were in a bad operating system. I mean, the social contract, the post-World War II social contract in the United States was not conducive to human flourishing. All right, the number of housewives that were addicted to prescription medicines and then locked up, was outrageous, and the people in the 60s revolted against that. But, so it's totally understandable. But when it goes too far, you think that you don't like, you're told to get with the program. Iggy Pop says this in his Terry Gross interview, I think. You're told to get with the program, and you don't want to be part of that program. But you can't just take a leap into the void. If you have no program whatsoever, no operating system, there's nothing.
Yeah.
And so what was great about the 60s were attempts to create new operating systems, but you have to build on what you have. And this gets back to where we are. I mean, culture is the operating system. Everything's filtered through culture. So you might say, with Grand Priest, these limits, he wants to both, he'd probably go nuts here, but he says he wants to be with the hippie. No, we have to transcend this and get beyond it into the void, but also at the same time be with the conservative. Yeah, be with the conservative. There's no alternative. It's a true contradiction.
Yeah.
And
like isn't it pretty much a fact that we are constrained by our language? And by language at all in general, in order to convey ideas,
yes,
between two human beings.
But at the same time, we somehow transcend that.
I guess. But
it always has to be there to be transcended, I guess.
I guess we can transcend that through metaphor and poetry, so that.
I think that's what Heidegger was trying to do, and maybe Derrida in a spin period was trying to do. So, and philosophers are terrible at doing it. Poets are good at doing it.
So that mercury, like the element mercury, it's just mercury, or that's what we like to try to do, is make it only mercury or only sodium, or or nickel or whatever, And so it's like you have this symbol, and that represents exactly what mercury is, but. And I don't know. I don't really see how. So.
Well, can I get back to something you said earlier, because I don't want to lose it?
Okay.
So Grand Priest's view is that these are two contradictions. Harman's view is that, no, he doesn't accept true contradictions. He wants to be the Kantian finitude before the totality, but he still wants to do a totalizing metaphysics. But what he does is he reinterprets what that metaphysics is doing. So metaphysics itself is more like art. I'm giving you a picture of a totality. If I push it far enough, there's going to be limit contradictions. There are going to be other pictures that are different. But what this picture's doing is much more like what Socratic wisdom is trying to get us. So we're playing a game in language, and this is where what you said earlier about how do we break out metaphor, poetry. For Harman, this is my interpretation of him, metaphysics is poetry. But that doesn't mean metaphysicians need to write like bad poets. We still do what we've always done, but we it's like at the end of 4 quartets, you get back to where you started, but you see it completely differently. You're back where you started. So for Harman, you're back where you started. We're still writing metaphysics, but we need to understand. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to work this out in my book more, is that his own metaphysical system makes sense of that looping back. And part of his system goes into the second thing, which you were saying about Mercury. For Harman, he gets this from Heidegger. When you look at a table, right, you're only interacting with the parts of the table that you can interact with and the properties of the table you can interact with, right? There's a being to the table that utterly transcends your finite perspective on it, right? What Harman wants to do to get out of the Berkeleyan idealism is to say that when any two objects interact, they're only finite for each other in the same way, all right? So they're both actualizing properties for each other, what he calls sensual properties. They're actualized but there's the being of the table is not exhausted by the properties that come out. So when I articulate the being of the table in language, I'm dicing up the world with language according to the properties that are manifest to me. They can be treated by language. Not all the properties that are manifest to us are treated well by language. Musical notes aren't. I can get to that, but you dice up the world. That's but it's still finitude, right? Now, and so the idea is that objects that are it's not Berkeley. Any two objects are sort of in this dance with one another where they become aware. So the neutrino's experience of the table is completely different from mine. The fire's experience of the table, the heat under these candles, is different from my experience of the table. And Harman has this picture of how that is in the being of the table pulling back. But again, this gets back to what you're saying. So I can model what you said about Mercury with Harman's metaphysics. I can get prior to the limit contradiction with this aesthetics, picture of aesthetics. But if I read one of Harman's books, that's in language too. Right? So if I accept Harman's view, by his own view, his own philosophy itself has to be finite. And so there will be other philosophies, and they may be more beautiful. And again, we get back to Aquinas. God is truth, goodness, and beauty for Aquinas, right? So Tristan Garcia and Grand Priest, they're really pushing truth. And you get this picture of their true contradictions, because when we describe it, we get these contradictions. Harman is pushing beauty, and some says beauty is prior to him, and that's the measure. And that may sound dumb. I mean, that could be evil. That can, you can push beauty over goodness and lead to evil. The Nazis were wonderful aesthetes,
Yeah.
I mean, they invented the rock concert. We still use the colors red and black in rock concerts. The Pink Floyd The Wall, have you seen it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the main character's hallucination, is that he's a fascist character because of the commonalities of what he sees going on. But so you don't. I'm not saying I love rock and roll. I'm not saying it's bad because of that. If you say aesthetics is first, you can justify, well, then the ethical content doesn't matter, and Harman's not doing that. And in fact, I think for Harman that the wisdom that philosophy gives you orients you towards the world and your interactions with other people. Some people think Harman's conservative. He's not. But he has...
Doesn't sound conservative to me.
Yeah. He has a little bit of humility about what ideology can accomplish. Because again, when we ideologize, we're putting the world into language and a way to direct our behavior in a certain way. Well, you need this openness that, with Harman, there's always has to be this openness that you're wrong. But for both Harman and Priest and Garcia, that doesn't mean stop. All right? Because you could just be a quietist and say, well, we're not going to get it right, let's not do anything. We can't but do this, but it's always at the same time when we're talking about totalities, there always has to be some kind of humility.
So I guess I could just tell you what I believe about some of the things that you've been saying, just according to what I believe. But which is pretty much that. So we are three-dimensional creatures. Like we live in this 3D world. I always like to refer back to Michio Kaku's book Hyperspace, and where he describes like a two-dimensional being. It could be a stick man. He doesn't know the difference between up and down, and so if you draw a circle around him, then he becomes imprisoned. And we're on this higher third dimension, and so if something existed in the fifth dimension, whereas all solids, I don't really know all of my dimensions, but I know at least mathematically, there's different, people say different numbers, but mathematically there's 11, 12 dimensions that can be proven on paper, at least. We can't experience them because we're three-dimensional creatures, but we can mathematically prove them. I have an uncle who said that, my uncle said there's something like 196,000, I don't know, it's called the monster group. There's 196,000, 462, say, dimensions. I don't see why dimensions would have to be infinite almost, because if there's one, why would there not be, like, so say that, one planet, one sun, but multiple, one universe, so there could be more than one. Anyway, so that we're three-dimensional creatures, we can only experience reality in three dimensions, and we can only talk or think even, and thinking that might be a little bit too far, but we can only convey messages in spoken sound and written word. Even if you knew every language on the planet, you still would have to, if you could speak and convey and even mix them up, you would still be constrained to human language as a whole. And that if we're three-dimensional creatures, we can only experience things in three dimensions, and that we can only posit what is out there, what is beyond this dimension. And I don't agree with Wittgenstein saying that, whatever you cannot speak of, you must remain silent. He said it much more eloquently, but I don't really agree with that, because what else are you supposed to do? Just not try?
Yeah, Karl Popper, I think it was Popper, made fun of Wittgenstein and said, well, you can't sing it either, and you can't hum it either. Well, of course you can. Right? Well, what's going on with music?
It's like it's what we're here, and from my understandings in the last few years, it's almost like we're here because there's something that we're supposed to learn. Like there's some big revelation that we're allowed to be here in this timeline as who we are, because there's something that we're supposed to learn. There's some grand realization, spiritual, metaphysical, philosophical, that could all be combined into one. There's something that we're here because there's something that we're supposed to learn, and I think that it's different for each and every one of us too. So we must.
Yeah, I hope that's true.
We must keep on questioning and keep trying to break through the ceiling and break through ceilings and ceilings. And some people have been more successful than others at doing so. Well, what I was about to say is not necessarily true, but I was about to say, well, some people are born in a third world country. They might have a second grade education at best. They have less vocabulary, so less thinking tools, thinking skills, and so they're not able to come to as grand of realizations about the ultimate nature of reality as someone who has gone all the way through a PhD, has been like in real rigorous, has obtained a very high vocabulary, but at the same time that person,
though in fact the person with the second grade education might in fact attain more of a realization.
Yeah, right. Because Buddhist monks,
And lots of educated fools,
because a lot of people have specialized themselves into narrowed their mind by specializing themselves into that's all they know. But there's an old Zen joke that after 20 years, or maybe it's not a joke, but after 20 years, after 20 years, the Zen master has realized that there's nothing to teach. That the sound of rain needs no interpretation. Or that, so I think that since we're limited, and I think that the Buddhists realize that, and realize that this moment is all there is. And so the mystical experience is always an experience of being beyond the filters. Like, so being able to see beyond what we can normally see, because I think that our brains interpret this three-dimensional reality three-dimensionally, and that there are other dimensions going on at the same time, but we cannot perceive them because of the limited capacity of our brain's ability.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, for me, I don't. Some of the dimension talk just makes me confused. I remember I took astronomy classes, and you get like, oh, imagine these two-dimensional creatures on a balloon, and the balloon's getting bigger. How would they measure parallel lines and stuff like that? Yeah. And I could understand that. Okay, it's the parallel postulate would be false in this way if they, but then the professor would say, okay, we'll just generalize that from 3 to 4 dimensions, and that's what we are. What? I can't do that. I'm sorry. So I don't.
I know what you mean, and maybe it's bullshit. Like, maybe there are no other dimensions. Maybe this is the only dimension. Just because it's been proven mathematically doesn't mean that they have to exist. Because another thing I was going to get to is that it seems like to me that science and religion and language are simply the best that we've had. They're simply the best that we have. So they're tools that we've developed in order to master our environment for the sake of survival. And so I think over time, as people of more privilege are past the surviving state.
Can you? Because you said something really interesting, and I had to say that little story from physics, and I had something like I was thinking about that really deeply. What you said. Okay. That I was going to do this tangent about the story with the physics guy. And I forgot what I was thinking about. It was really interesting. It was way more interesting than, I don't know what a dimension is. So if you could just...
So we're three-dimensional creatures, and we can only understand things three-dimensionally. Yeah. And so if there are higher dimensions, which is what it seems like we're trying to get to through religion and philosophy and even science, we're trying to understand these higher dimensions just like a fish in a fishbowl is trying to understand the water that it's in, or trying to understand what's outside of the fishbowl, but at the same time it can't, because it's in the fishbowl, like it lives in it, like it's one and the same. They're completely 100% interdependent, and so, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean that some haven't succeeded more so than others. And so when they come back and they're conveying this, what their experience of oneness and of God, and of everything being one organism, then language is simply the best that we have, though.
Yeah, my favorite. I've got two stories that reminds me of, and one is we talked about Aquinas a number of times. Weirdly, I'm not an expert in him at all, but how God is truth, goodness, and beauty. But Aquinas, at one point, he writes this huge book. He changes Roman Catholicism completely away from Neoplatonism towards Aristotelianism, and invents Thomism. But he's writing a book, and he has this experience, and he just stopped writing. I don't need to do that anymore, right? And it's exactly what you're saying. And my other favorite story is another Roman Catholic, Thomas Merton. Wonderful book, 7-Story Mountain, about how he decided to become a monk in his 40s, I think. He was a wonderful man, and that book became a bestseller. And he, in the monastery, these people from all over the world are writing him letters, and he had a correspondence with Thich Nhat Hanh, who was the great Buddhist peace activist from Vietnam. And he wanted to go, and he's involved in the ecumenical movement. He wanted to go to Asia for years, as far as I understand, and the abbot of the monastery wouldn't let him. Finally, the guy gave him permission. So he goes to Thailand, and he kept a journal, and it's really wonderful, this journal, when he's in Thailand. But he goes out and he sees some of these old, huge Buddha statues. And this guy's a serious contemplative. He's been a monk for a long time now and writes beautiful stuff. But he had this overwhelming experience, and he had some insight, right? He goes back to his hotel room, takes a shower, and he's got it. It's like Aquinas. He's got it, right? As he's getting out of the shower, he reaches up to turn a fan off and gets electrocuted and killed, right? Wow. That's not a bad way to go out,
Yeah.
having that Aquinas moment, I guess. So we keep looping back to this, the limits of language and overcoming the limits of language. Language is it's wonderful. It's recursive. It allows us to, I think that our dogs are thinking after a sense, but there are adult humans who never learned a language because they were deaf, and they were born in a poor country that didn't have sign language. They never learned to read lips. And some scientists have found some people like this, and they're in California, and they've been working in the farm economy, like from Honduras or Nicaragua. And they've managed to teach them sign language as adults. There's all sorts of fascinating stuff. But what's weird is some of these people report having had beliefs prior to having language. So if I remember right, one of them, when he saw the Pacific Ocean first time, thought it must be God's toilet, right?
Wow.
Did he really believe that, or was that something he posited back after he learned the concept of God and language? It's very hard to say, and we don't understand this at all. But, just the thought, my wife's probably going to come here around 7 p.m., but she may be a little bit later if the kids are fussy or so. I don't think my dog can think anything like that without the language. So it gives us a lot, but it traps us too. I mean, and so we're talking about music, and there's something the philosopher Diana Raffman, they call it Raffman qualia now. I forget who the scholar was about this idea, but in different parts of the world, people have different musical systems. So Indian classical music has quarter tones, and since there's quarter tones, there's 24 notes instead of 12 notes in an octave. That you could hit going from a C to a higher C, for example. And Indian classical music involves hitting these quarter tones. Now, blues musicians will bend the guitar strings up to a quarter tone sometimes, but it's really part of the music in a complicated, articulated way in Indian music, in a way it's not in Western music. So I thought, well, let's do these tests. They would play for musicians a note, say a C, then play some other notes, and you're supposed to say, at what point do you hear the same note again? Right? And you're also supposed to say, is this note higher or lower? Right? And the weirdest thing is the ability to re-recognize a note after some time had passed, after there've been other notes, as the same note. And you don't have any notation or anything, you're just hearing it. The Indian musicians did it on the half-tone scale. So they would collapse the quarter tone over C to a C. They would collapse quarter tones and listening. And so that's interesting. It seems like there's something almost innate about a 12-tone scale. as far as the ability to re-identify, but also points to something that philosophers call non-conceptual content, and we argue about this all the time. Philosophers do, but just the idea that our sensations are so key to fine-grained discrimination in ways that vastly outstrip what we can articulate in language. So Rathband's idea is something like this, that our language sort of tracks, I'm sure I'm getting this wrong in the particulars, but this ability to recognize, to recognize later as being the same, that's sort of a constraint on what language tracks, right? But our ability to appreciate differences in the moment and over short periods of time is vastly more fine-grained than what we can recognize over time. And there's lots of experiments that are still going on to try to understand this stuff. When I'm about to get a migraine headache, I know I'm about to get it because the green of the world is almost unbearably beautiful. I hate migraine headaches. Luckily, as I've gotten older and eat a lot of spicy food, I think that's helped for some reason. But I don't get them as bad as I used to, where I'd be nauseated and just completely out of it. But I still get them not as bad, and my vision gets wonky. But I'll have this moment where I'm outside and the greenness and the trees and the grass, leaves. I am aware that I'm experiencing so, it's not infinite, but it seems infinitely fine gradations of greenness. And it's makes me want to cry sometimes. It's so beautiful. And
that's awesome.
If I could,
there's no way
if
you
I
can
could paint
articulate
that, if I could paint that,
yeah,
it would be great. I can't.
Yeah. I guess you could.
But it's maybe I could try. I don't know. But it so much transcends my color words. And I think any good artist is, but all of us have this ability. So language is, it's completely liberating and allow us to structure our world, structure our lives in various ways, and to plan things for the future and to understand things in certain ways. But also, even just at that very basic level of being able to differentiate in our appreciation of beauty, again, truth, beauty, and goodness, you're really missing something if you think that language is the royal road to wisdom there, or to beauty, or to anything, or to our cognition, our interface with the world. Just at the level of colors and visually, is so radically transcends the differentiations we can make in language. And some people are better. There's this the Eskimo snow hoax. It's not true that there are groups of Inuits that have 87 nouns for snow. It's just not true. And there's a great book by Jeffrey Poland, the linguist, called The Great Eskimo Snow Hoax. The Eskimos can say the Inuits in question can say the snow is wet, it's packed, but we can say that in English too, right? And so people argue about that, to what extent language shapes how you perceive the world. And for a while, it was dead. Nobody thought it shaped it at all because of all the overstatement. But now people are getting back and thinking it does to some extent. And there's a lot of research about that. But however that is, we have a phenomenal experience of the world that's radically richer than what we can put into experience. And that's just a very basic, simple level, and a simple way that our experience, our interface with the world transcends what we can say. And it's very hard to say what animals are going through. I mean, for dogs, smell is localized. Imagine if your vision was unlocalized. I came in this room and I was just like, oh, Damon's here. There's some Damon in the room. Just like you come in and you smell cinnamon, or, if you're trying to sell your house, they say to put a cinnamon stick and boil it in water. So people come in and smell this. Ooh, it's a happy smell. I don't know if that really works. But a dog comes in and they the smell of the cinnamon is there. Just like when we see the cinnamon stick, it's there. Oh. So for us, a dog to try to understand what smell is to us would be like us trying to understand non-localized vision. I think some sea creatures maybe have non-localized vision, I read, but it's very hard for us to say what that is. So there's,
I was going to say sonar, but that's not true. Sonar is locating.
Yeah.
Where it exactly is locating.
Yeah, and the great article by Thomas Nagel, Thomas Nagel, what is it like to be
that? Yeah.
Yeah. And, I had a friend who's legally blind, and his parents just treated him, as far as I can tell, like he wasn't. And, he has almost like superpowers. I think it's probably sonar that he's using.
Wow.
But,
so, if I was going to say about, I spent like, I guess 10 years, at least 10 years, 6 years as an undergraduate, getting the 2 degrees, and then in graduate school for a few years and stuff in between. Being taught and being instilled in me concepts, theories, theses, concepts, rules, and of all sorts: mathematics, philosophy, science, English, rules of language, and how they should be used in a certain way. So much so that it made me almost atheistic for a few years, especially psychology, because everything is based on conditioning, rewards, and punishments. Everything is reinforcing, whether you're dancing or puking. Everything you do is reinforcing. It's so behavioristic, so atheistic that I kind of got sucked into that for a while. And then after those 10 years, I had a couple of mystical experiences, and so now I'm trying to graduate to the aconceptual. I'm trying to graduate beyond concepts and theories, because I think that they're constraining me. And also another reason why is having kids, like having little kids. Like my wife said, they don't care about concepts and rules. Like right now, like a 3-year-old just wants to play with his toys, or just wants to run outside in the sunshine. And so we all wish to be able to get back to those childhood eyes. And I guess I'm trying to do that. But
Jesus says you have to. That's the weirdest thing in the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, you have to do that.
I believe that. And that totally congrues with Buddhism too. But so I'm trying to graduate to the aconceptual. Now, I think that I'm trying to live in a constant state of satori. So the Buddhist concept of satori is, it's sort of like a peak experience that we all have from time to time, maybe for like a few seconds, when we're alone in nature. So say you're alone in front of a mountain, or you're alone at the beach. Yeah,
so I would call that a state of grace.
State of grace, okay.
I think it's the same.
It probably is. A state of grace or peak experience, or to where so you're alone in nature, in the woods, and nature of some sort. Usually that's where it occurs. It doesn't have to, but you can be at a red light and stuck in traffic, But to describe that experience, so you're alone in nature, and for a few seconds you really understand, that all is one, and that you and nature, that you are not one with nature, but that you are nature, that you and nature are one and the same, that you're alive, and in that moment you give gratitude to be able to be experiencing that moment, that you're alive with the here on this earth, in this beauty that has been developed or created, and so that is called in Buddhism a state of satori. I am trying to be in a constant state of satori. I would like to graduate to that point. That is the next goal of my spiritual path, to constantly be in that state of beauty, like you were saying, that you see the green, the trees, and it's so beautiful. I don't want to be crying all the time.
Well, you don't want a migraine headache after either. Yeah.
Walking around crying all the time. It's so beautiful, it's so beautiful. The table is so beautiful, But there comes problems with that. I'm starting to realize.
Yeah.
Which is, it seems like my language, my vocabulary has degraded over the last years. There are other reasons for that too, I haven't. It's been 6 years since I've been in graduate school.
Yeah.
So I graduated in 2011. Now it's 2017. It's been that long. And remember when you were a kid after the summertime and you came back, you could barely even write your name.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not in that environment anymore. And so, but as soon as I got out of that environment, I started to try to graduate to the aconceptual, reading like Alan Watts and Buddhism and all these, and I started studying all these different religions, Hinduism and Taoism, and it seemed to make more sense to me. And so that Buddhist monks, they seem to not just say, well, we're not going to think and we're not going to use language and we're not going to have any rules. They have a lot of rules and a lot of rituals. And those rituals are the reason why, for a long time I thought, like Catholicism, there's so many rituals, or Buddhism. So Christ and Buddha both taught that they tried the ritual path and it didn't work for them.
Yeah.
But yet, after their death, the churches that are constructed from their teachings use nothing but rituals. And so I finally learned the other day when someone said, why? It's because, so in the Hindu tradition, they use the word Om. Om is supposed to be the vibration that created the universe, and it's infinite. It created the universe, and all that's here, it's going to be like Om to them is the vibration that is equivalent to the Tao or to God. And so this vibration, so the Om is something that they chant, Om, Om, or Ram, Ram, and they have different levels of Om and different, but Om is the main word. And I'm like, that seems kind of silly. Why do that? Why have to have that ritual? Well, it's because when you say Om, 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 you're stopping thought. And so when you and according to their teachings, your mind is your worst enemy.
The monkey mind.
Yeah, your mind is your worst enemy because your mind is constantly interjecting into it thoughts. So usually for a lot of people like me, constantly worried about the future or the past. You know, I should have done this better. You know, after this podcast, when I listen to it, I'll think, man, I should have said this or there. I shouldn't have said that. You know, or relations. Usually, like if you have these relations between people during the day, whether it be customers or students or whoever they are, you'll spend a lot of time thinking, man, you know, I shouldn't have said that or done that. Maybe, you know, or in the future. So. Living in the past causes depression. Living in the future causes anxiety. So you're always worried about the future, and it's just it's just a survival mechanism of how we are and who we are, how we get around.
So I mean, is Satori being present? Would you?
Yeah.
You would define Satori as being present?
Yeah, but completely, like 1,000% present, and. It is, in those moments are beyond language. Those moments are beyond
you said something interesting earlier.
Understanding language concepts.
You said something interesting that ties to, again, Presbyterian theology, which is guilt, grace, gratitude. The world's out of whack. I'm out of whack, but I have these experiences of grace. And my response to that is one of gratitude. You mentioned out of Satori, gratitude coming out of that.
Yeah.
I think when you act on gratitude, since we're linguistic creatures, that's going to put you back in the realm of language and into the conceptual. But then I guess the question is, how are you in the realm of conceptual? And I think this is generally paradoxical in the very sense we've been talking about, that aconceptual is also being outside of, being without concepts is being outside of the conceptual realm.
Yeah.
But when it comes back to acting, but when that gratitude, you know, unless you're just the drop in the ocean, that gratitude, you're back in the conceptual.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a way to think about the importance of gratitude, is that gratitude, if you know, truly acting through gratitude, maybe keeps you out of trouble
But it's like,
can
what
you
is
be conceptual without craving?
It's like, what is that gratitude?
Yeah.
I just feel like gratitude should be given. I don't know, man. That's really complicated.
It's a great Beastie Boys song. The song with the down, down, down. I can't. The videos like Pink Floyd's at Pompeii, they recapitulated it, but it's the Beastie Boys. Have you ever seen it?
No.
Oh yeah, you like it.
I remember the Beastie Boys.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to it.
Yeah.
Okay, but I interrupted you to talk about a song. Yeah, I thought that would be helpful.
So like I'm trying to graduate to the aconceptual and live in a state of satori at all times. But there comes problems with that, because what about having stuff and doing stuff and setting goals and accomplishing them? But the thing is, so one of the main lessons of Taoism is that you're supposed to be able to do those things.
Action without action.
Yeah, you're supposed to be able to do those things
without doing them in the
without like making it so serious, like making it so imperative, or serious would be a better word. So when you're trying to meditate, like we were talking about earlier, like I'm going to meditate and I'm going to become enlightened. It's like the reason why that's supposed to not work is because you are trying to, you're turning it into a concept. You're turning it into a thought to goal. You're turning it into a structure, into a point A to point B timeline. And so if your mind is your worst enemy, and so if you can only experience reality as it is in its full extent at all times.
Well, I think, again, I want to go back to Graham Harman.
I'm trying to figure it out.
His insight is that the language, so the problem is that language we're putting a bunch of different philosophies together, but the language, it puts you back in this realm of craving, right? You're slicing and dicing the universe, so it's, mine, and craving and anxiety. But Harman's thought again is that, well, that's not all language is doing. And so the dichotomy between the aconceptual and the conceptual linguistic, that is a dichotomy, but what is the language is doing that's in contrast to the aconceptual? And I think what Harman would say, well, we do other things with language too, right? And so maybe there's an analog there with acting in the world. If you're helping someone, I guess you can do it for the wrong reason. You could do it for egoic reasons because you want to be a good person, and wanting to be a good person is being better than other people, right? There's a great poem by D.H. Lawrence called "The English Are So Nice."
Does this candle distract you?
No, not at all.
Okay.
So, and I can't recite, I don't know the poem, but the English are so nice, and the narrator is talking about how the other people aren't as nice as the English people. That he's English, and he's not being very nice, and how he's talking about how other people aren't nice. You have to be nice to Germans and English, but not too nice because they'll take advantage. They don't really understand what niceness is.
Well,
it's this wonderful, so you can be nice and for all the wrong reasons where you're not really being nice because of why you're being nice, and it will deconstruct itself in the behavior too. It'll come out in the action. But maybe if you're acting out of gratitude or something else, the action is doing something different. Maybe language, maybe understanding the language is doing something different. I don't know. There's poetry. Can you make movement? Can you make movement? Can you make all movement dance? I don't know. Can you make all language poetry? Would that be a good thing? But there is dance and there is poetry in the world, and it's aconceptual in that it's beyond, it's the language and the movement doing something beyond the evil grasping and craving I shouldn't say evil, the grasping and craving that's the root of suffering, right? Dancing and poetry is beyond that. But nonetheless, it's still human movement. You're not just sitting still meditating. It's still using language So my hope would be that, what you're getting with the radical aconceptual moments, hopefully can still be there when you're in the realm of conceptuality. Again, we go back, is this Grand Priest? Are you just living in contradiction? And is reality contradictory? So you're bearing witness to reality, you're instantiating it in the correct way and living in contradiction. Or with Graham Harman, are you seeing that what you're doing within the limits is different? It's a different thing from so language, there's limits of description, but we're not just describing with language. Maybe there's an ethical analog to that where we can get woo-wee, action without action. I don't know, but it's a very interesting thought. I think these same things about the limits of conceptuality, the limits of knowability, the limits of describability. I think what I'm getting from talking to you that's really interesting is that if you think of it in a Buddhist context, there's an ethical analog to that's central to life.
I think I may have figured out a way out of, living in a state of satori or a state of pure experience, raw experience, and still having concepts, which is just to realize that concepts are simply a game. Like, so to see outside of the concepts that they exist, and language exists, and science exists, and religion exists, and culture exists, but they're not the all and end all. That so like whenever you have emotions, those emotions are not necessarily you. If you can separate yourself from your emotions, it's not you at all. It's not, which almost suggests a soul or a central self, which that could be problematic. But to say that your emotions occur at certain points in time, but as a whole, they don't represent who you are as a person. You happen to be angry at one moment, jealous at one moment, ecstatic at one moment, but those are just momentary. Maybe I'm threading myself in the traps here, but I guess in other words, I think it is okay to have all the concepts in the world, all the concepts that are available as human beings, and still live in a state of satori or mindfulness, because sort of like money, you can have all the money you want as long as you know that your money shouldn't make up who you are as a person. You can have ego all you want as long as you know that your ego is not you. It's a like a byproduct or maybe a function of you. So, and that ego is necessary most of the time in order to express yourself.
Yeah, it's hard for me because I have such a tragic sense of existence that, there's part of me that's saying, we're not going to do it. But I don't want to be dismissive in that sense. And I wouldn't go to church. I always hope these things are possible. I listen to everything's music with me. What's the song by Stevie Wonder? I'm so darn glad I get to try it again. Last time on Earth, the Higher Ground. When I first heard Stevie Wonder's version, I was in a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and I said, "This is a terrible cover of the Red Hot Chili Peppers." I'm so embarrassed by that now. And now it's the opposite. So he plays it on Sesame Street, if I remember right. It's wonderful. You can get it on YouTube. We get out of this. A lot of us get out of this through eschatology, through, the way you get out of contradictions like this. The way that Hegelians seem to, is, you put it in time and it's a process. So the contradiction leads you to the next level, and we're going to get better and better. And there's something right about that, and I like that, and I think we have to think that way. But at the same time, I also sometimes think that maybe you can't get it right. Again, the Bodhisattva, when you're finally at enlightenment, you can't get there if you still want to be enlightened, because that's still craving. if you're desiring it, there's always this danger of turning it into. There's a great book by the guy who, I forget his name. God, he wrote a great book called A Short History of a Small Place. Anyone listening to this, if this makes it in the final cut, but get that book. It's a wonderful book. He wrote another book about a new priest who's like in a small Alabama town who starts, or maybe Mississippi town, starts a meditation time. And and it's all women that are sitting there, these Southern women. Like, I grew up in Alabama, so I can talk about this without being insulting. And they have to sit on the floor to meditate, but it's like in the church basement, and the floor's kind of dusty. So they've got some napkins from the potluck supper, with all of the attendant nastiness of 1980s Alabama potluck suppers. There's like 3 dishes of meat with grape jelly and the meat in a crock pot. And if you grew up in Alabama in the 1970s and 80s, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so they've got these napkins, and they've got to put them on the floor to sit on them so they can sit and meditate. But then it becomes a contest to see how few napkins you can use. So if you use too many napkins, that means your rear end is like large. And the way he's writing this up, this whole meditation thing becomes like, who can sit on the fewest napkins? And that's your desire for enlightenment becomes desire, and the desire is corrupted because it reinforces the ego, and the ego is craving, and the ego is pride, which is the greatest sin. Pride isn't thinking you did a good job. Pride is thinking it's intolerable that somebody else is better than you or higher than you, because that's a threat to your ego, right? So, okay, I desire a dissolution of that kind of ego. I don't want it, but it's me that doesn't want it.
Yeah.
And that's building on my ego, and that's craving.
Right.
And so can we get to like the true Satori, the ski that's going down the slope unimpeded? Can that be our reality? And I think that's a norm that should be normative. I think our society would be better. Here I'm wanting to be God. I'm thinking about all of society, all of the world that I want to impose my will on, because they should all be more Buddhist.
Yeah.
They should all not want to impose their will on the world like me, but I'm trying to impose my world on them by making them not impose the world on the will. Will on the world. So, you know, how do you to be enlightened? You have to no longer desire enlightenment, but the desire of enlightenment can make you more enlightened. And what do we say about this hyperbolic desire for constant satori? I don't know. I mean, I one thing I want to get from that is you have to face the contradiction. I think we talked about this earlier. The Bhagavad Gita is an attempt to face that. It is a promise that you can be taking care of your kids, sitting in line in the carpool lane, and it's Louisiana, so it's really friggin' hot, and it's so hot that like if you're still and you're running your AC, you're still hot in the car because you're not moving, and you've got to wait there, and you know, and then did your kids do their homework? You know, you've got to do all this stuff, and you've got to earn money, and you're trying to make sense of the world. It's future-oriented, because our experience is. That's anxiety. It's past-oriented. What is that? Guilt, you told me. Depression. So we're in this anxiety and depression. Can you do all of this and still be? And that's hard, because our experiences of being, our states of grace, are usually not when we're doing all that stuff. For most of us, it's a sunny day, and you're present. You're not anxious. There's no future. There's no past. You're present. So how can I be present in the times where I'm constitutionally required to think about the past and present? I have to pick the kids up at this time.
With so many tasks at hand.
Yeah. And that's the promise of the Bhagavad Gita. But it's not simple. Is this just a constitutive contradiction of our form of existence? I don't know. Is it a tragic situation? And we get back to Tristan Garcia, my book, Garcia.
It might be more of a modern problem, too.
Yeah, I mean, Hegel seems to think that these contradictions, a contradiction is a motor for development, and it can be a healthy motor, right? And you can keep making these, using wisdom to change, to be more and more present, you know? And maybe, and with traditional Hinduism, there's an eschatology. Once your kids are out of the house, that's how it works. You're not a householder anymore. You'll meditate a lot more, or play music, or write poetry, or paint, or whatever it is. You know, so that's one view. Tristan Garcia, he believes in dialectics like Hegel, but often the tension or the paradox is never going to be resolved for him, right? So let's talk about death. There are two traditions of death. One tradition comes from the Stoics. I hope I'm getting that right. And that's that it's irrational to worry about death. If you're dead, you're not there. Right?
Yeah.
Why am I worried about something that doesn't exist?
There's either something or there's nothing, you know.
And
would you even either know that you died or you might not know? Just lights out.
Yeah.
That's it.
And so that's one path. But then Garcia says something interesting. He says, that's what wisdom tells us to do, right? And we'll all go through that. We'll have to, I am kicking myself like Epictetus, or I forget who it was who said this, some Greek philosopher, Lucretius. But on the other hand, when it's somebody else's death, wisdom tells you not to do that. So we know dear friend and teacher Ian Crystal. He died like 4 years ago.
Yeah,
right.
I had him.
Yeah, and he was, next to my wife, he was my best friend for a number of years, and so it was horrible when he died. His helping his mom go through and his brother go through his stuff, and I would go to sleep, and as I was going to sleep, I'd hear his voice, like he was in the room, and I don't know what that was. It helped, and when someone you love dies, and this is going to happen to all of us. There's nothing unique about me. It's just that's the human condition is death. You're going to die. Hopefully, people love you. You're going to your people you love are going to go through this. You're going to go through it. And people you love are going to hurt, or you're going to hurt when they go through it. And it's just the human condition. Now, that stoic wisdom about dealing with your own death would be monstrous and inhuman in dealing with somebody else's death. It's proper. I don't know why, but I do know this as much as I know anything. It is proper to freak out and to grieve when somebody you love passes. That's what you're supposed to do. And the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, in order to get people's insurance to cover happy pills when they're going through this, with American insurance companies and the law, the only thing they had to do is they had to pathologize this. So now excessive grief is a pathology, and go read it. It's ridiculous. Yeah. Because healthy people grieve, and that's right. And Garcia makes this point in his book, and what he says is, you can't win. What's absolutely right for you to do with your own death is monstrous with someone else's death. But if you're sensitive to other people's death, that undermines your ability of equanimity. And I think what he thinks is, really thinks there's no wisdom, but I can reinterpret him. The road to wisdom is to understand the contradiction and to accept it. Maybe you can dance among the contradiction and get it better or worse. But sometimes I think that existence is tragic, and that's what we're confronted for. If there was a correct way to confront tragedy, it wouldn't be tragic, right? And that's the paradox. But we hope that there's some kind of salvation, some kind of wisdom that will give us strength. We're a sad culture because the people in our culture are so unprepared for reality. We are in a culture of denial of death. There's an awesome book and documentary called Flight from Death. And pretty much the main central thesis of that is that all religions are based on the fear of death. So that we are animals, we are mammals, we have hair, skin, teeth, nails, give live birth. So we are part of the animal kingdom, but we feel like with our amazing precognitive abilities, we're somehow gods in comparison to the rest of the animal kingdom. But and of course we're all born. Well, if you were born, we're all going to get sick, and we're all going to die. We're all going to grow older, we're all going to get sick, and we're all going to die. And we're all going to die. And each and every one, and I hear Alan Watts say that Goethe said that the greatest thing that one can realize is that you and everyone around you will soon be dead. And that seems to be so grim, but it's the truth. And
the older we get, the more we realize that, because the more of a time frame we have to build on. So when we're young, the reason why time seems to go by faster the older we get is because when we're 6 years old, you know, what happened last year, man, or 2 years ago, that's like a third of your life. You know, but when you're 40, 2 years ago, in comparison, is like really not that much. And sometimes I'll take a picture. I don't want to try to go off too much on a tangent, but sometimes nowadays I'll take a picture with my phone and realize that that picture is already gone, and that in a year from now I'll be seeing that picture, and that picture that also comes with digital cameras and phones and stuff like that. Like that picture is already in the past, far removed from the future that I will be in one day, and not that far from now. So death and flight from death, that all religions are based on fear of death. We're all going to get older and we're all going to die, for sure. It's like dying is the only thing that you have to do. You know, you don't have to do anything except for die. But so all religions being based on the fear of death, that kind of bothers me and bothers a lot of people.
But they respond to it in different ways. I mean, a friend of a friend of mine.
In other words, like the hope that there is something beyond death. Like this is not all there is. Like, man, there's got to be more to it. And if someone that close to you dies, really close to you dies, you really, really hope with all of your mind and soul that you're going to see him or her one day.
Yeah. And you hope for that more than you hope for your own survival. Like I think the desire for heaven is much more. You don't want that to be all there was with a friend, and more so than, oh, I want this for me or whatever. You know, it's the thought that I don't know.
And so, but I've been learning a lot of things that makes the probability of an afterlife a lot more realistic, not sensible, not reasonable, but realistic. So my wife's dad recently died at the beginning of the year, January 1st. And it was like he died in a car wreck. He was like 58 years old, you know.
Wow,
so it was like a sudden thing, you know.
Yeah.
It was unexpected. And I swear the next morning, you said you were hearing Ian talk to you, your friend who died. The next morning, I got out of bed, and before I could even barely like know what was going on because I'd just woken up, I heard. He used to call me, my name is Damon, but he used to call me Demon, which is always funny, like, you know,
yeah.
Demon, one letter away is Demon. He's like, Demon. He said, I'm okay. I'm better now. I'm better off now anyway. I'm okay.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I heard it loud, but it wasn't like me talking to you loud, but it was loud in my head. Like it was like a very loud thought. It was like if you said something to me, but if you said the same thing but saying the same thing to me, like on the other side of my skull, inside of my head. Anyway, it was loud, but it wasn't. It was pretty loud, and I didn't have time yet to. I might not have had time yet to construct it or imagine it, because I just got out of bed, just put my feet on the floor, the very next morning after he died. And I was like, whoa, you know, I didn't think much of it at the time, because I am a skeptic. I really am, you know, and it makes it hard because I am very skeptical. I do.
Yeah, me too.
Like, you know, all this spiritual mumbo jumbo and mysticism, mystical experiences and stuff, and quartz crystals, you know, crystals and meditation and stuff. But maybe it's just a product of my culture and education and stuff like that too. Obviously, of course it is, or just my personality. But
you know, a friend of mine was dying, and is I don't want to say who this was, but actually the Dalai Lama knew the guy, called him.
Wow.
His wife was holding the phone to his head, and the Dalai Lama said the guy's name and said, "I hear you're dying." And my friend's friend said, "Yeah." And the Dalai Lama said, "Congratulations." And for a Tibetan Buddhist, that's the kindest, biggest compliment you could give somebody, to tell them they're prepared to die. It's interesting. Tibetan Buddhism is my understanding of it, at least. I'm not. It seems very death obsessed because it's all about preparing yourself for death.
Yeah.
But in Christianity, isn't that, a lot of it centers around death. I mean, if you're part of a spiritual community that's big enough, you really see that. In my church, the number of widows is, you really realize that, how many women are left behind by men if you are part of a spiritual community. And a lot of, I think, so I used to not think this about Christianity, that Christianity was about preparing for death. But when you see how it works in spiritual communities, it is.
Like, I really want to see this person in heaven when I die too.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And so it kind of bothers me that maybe religion is a flight from death. Maybe trying to reach a certain spiritual state so that you can immortalize yourself is sort of like an escape from death, like trying to win over death.
But Buddhism, it's fairly honest, and I think Hinduism too, because my understanding, at least with most of it, the spiritual realization is that everything is one.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of death right there.
Yeah.
When you truly realize that. And I mean, at best, you're thinking God's thoughts. I mean, God is thinking God's thoughts. You're not. You're a pair of eyes and for God. And that's a kind of death, but it's, and in Buddhism, you again, the Diamond Sutra, you want to be until you even transcend that one, you want to be a drop of water in the ocean. There is no self. You want to realize that there's no self. But it's not that different from a Western perspective. The Hindu desire to realize that there's only self, and the Buddhist desire to realize that there's no self, because that Hindu self is God. And you do find the same thing in Christianity. I mean, some mystics say that, well, what are we going to do with your dead? Well, you'll be so busy staring at the face of God that you'll do that for eternity. Well, that's not like what it is now. And so we try to split the difference with eschatology. There's this book, I think Robin Williams was in a film about it, called What Dreams May Come. The same guy who wrote it wrote a very famous vampire story, one of the famous ones. I forget his name, but this is a common theme in this interview, me remembering books and not remembering the author's name. But in it, I mean, it's this new agey thing. You sort of like go to these different levels where you sort of work through all the trauma in your life. I think Evenings with Maury, or 5 People You Meet Before You Die, was the book. One of these other new agey books was like that. And it gets sort of better and better, but at the end of it, you may spend another 2,000 years or 10,000 years with your wife or something, but at the end of it, you sort of go off and be with God, and that's sort of eternity. And that's, that really is, that's death too. I mean, it's a nice death, but the Spinoza was really interested in this. Spinoza believes in immortality, but what immortality is it's realizing that, what are the 3 things you said? Time is now is eternal? I forget.
Yeah, eternity in every moment, divinity in every particle, and all is one organism. I revisited Spinoza, reading Spinoza like last year for the first time since like my second semester as an undergraduate.
But for him, eternity is now, and that's the only eternity.
And I was like,
so
wow.
It's not eschatological.
This dude, like, he's articulating so many things that I'm trying to say.
But death is for yourself at least, and maybe you get the contradiction we talked about earlier. It's immortality isn't something that happens after you die. If you're having thoughts I think for him it would be mathematics, but you're thinking of these this perfect, it's atemporal, it's eternal. For your finite mind to be able to, Plato was moved by this too. One of Plato's arguments for the immortality of the soul is based on that in the Phaedo. When you are thinking of things that are eternal, you are paradoxically a finite soul are participating in infinity. And so for that picture, that's immortal because it's eternal. Part of you is eternal because part of you has to be, this is Plato's argument, and Spinoza, I think, bought it. But Plato says this is why Socrates is going to kill himself, because his soul will go be with the forms. Spinoza, it's not that something then happened. That's missing the point to think that this is an argument that something will happen after, because you are outside of the after. This is realizing that each moment is eternal, that we have the aspect to do that, and that's what immortality is. Kurt Vonnegut, we talked about him. He thematizes this over and over again. They're creatures that get unstuck in time. In Slaughterhouse-Five, the main character, his phenomenology is going back. It's a wonderful metaphor for post-traumatic stress and him being stuck in the bombing of Dresden, which he suffered, right? But also there are creatures in his that show up in his novels that are entirely outside of time, and they perceive everything as an eternal present, right? And so for Spinoza, the eternity and the moment in the eternal present, we as creatures that are, where our present is composed of the future and the past, and anxiety and depression, as you say, we have the capacity to transcend that. Maybe for Plato and Spinoza through knowledge of mathematics, maybe through other ways, but that is immortality, right? We're part of this eternal present.
Yeah.
We're the minds and the eyes of God, but that doesn't mean I'm God. That means God is me. All right, God is, this is Hegel. The universe, if it's in time, it's that the universe is becoming self-conscious in time. Matter is becoming spirit. What is matter becoming spirit? It's the universe becoming aware of itself. I'm just dead matter, right? But I'm also dead matter becoming aware of dead matter. So the matter's not dead. This takes place in time, but at least, I don't know about for Hegel, for Spinoza and Plato, the way that takes place in time maybe Kant too, actually, puts me outside of time. And so, but that's thin rule when you're thinking about your best friend or your father-in-law you loved. When I think about that, I want more. A lot of me, I'm skeptical like you, but a lot of me thinks that probably Spinoza's onto something there, and Hegel are onto something. But I still hope for more.
Yeah, and the thing is, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
And so if you spend your whole life philosophizing, spending time in metaphysics and spirituality, which is, I think, a form of metaphysics, just without... No. But anyways, if you spend your life in philosophy, spirituality, metaphysics, trying to gain higher and higher levels of consciousness, which is trying to gain higher and higher levels of what makes us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom, and what we do best is gain higher and higher levels of intelligence, because we have that ability to do so, given by God or given by circumstance, and that we should use that and at most that to the best of our ability. And if there is nothing after death, if we are able to gain states of satori or presentness or being present at all times, then we have lived. We have almost united with the immortal while we were living, instead of waiting for an after, like, say, everything's going to be better when I'm dead. When I go to heaven, or when I go to wherever, the different descriptions of wherever that place is, I'll be better off then. So I'll just drudge my way through life and wait till that time. Like that's wrong. Like, no, it's sort of like people saying, I'm going to die anyway.
Some people's life is so terrible. I mean,
yeah,
you can't take that away from somebody.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
maybe. I don't know. I mean, I've got friends who are, I don't know.
They're sort of like eating crap food, junk food.
Yeah.
Say like, if you eat health food, everything that tastes like crap is usually the best for us, and everything that tastes awesome is usually the worst for us. So if you just eat junk food all the time, people say, well, I'm going to die anyway. I'm just going to eat whatever I want. But the problem is that while you're alive, you're not going to feel as good, or your mind is not going to work as good. And so if your mind doesn't work as good, you're not going to be able to experience as well. And so if you're not experiencing as well, then you're not like living and being in the moment. You're living less.
I think even if there is like a place after this where our souls are still finite, so we're still recognizably ourselves and have our egos.
Yeah.
Spinoza's thing is still true there. That's not immortality. That's more time in heaven. The only immortality, even then, is going to be the states of grace or the states of satori.
Yeah.
I think my brain's done, man.
Well,
so let's wrap. Anyway, Emily's about to get here.
All right, cool, man. Cool.
What have we learned?
We have learned that. Let's see. Well, we have, I think, advanced a lot of things that we were thinking about.
Yeah. One thing I learned is that there's a formal logic of enclosure paradoxes that Graham Priest and Bertrand Russell and logicians do. And so one of the things I've been thinking about, how does this apply to the history of philosophy? How does this apply to things that are going on about in continental philosophy in particular? One of the things I've got from talking to you is that I think it applies in ethics in interesting ways, and what we should do. And you articulated interesting ethical claims about how you tie these. If you believe in moments of, if you believe in satori or states of grace, and aconceptuality is a big part of that. What is that? How does that tie to what you do when you're forced to contend with conceptuality? And maybe you see similar contradictions that have to be confronted. And maybe it's a way you're living the contradictory reality, or maybe there's something different. And we tie this to the Bhagavad Gita and the Eastern tradition. So it's a lot to think about, actually, for me.
And that contradictions are necessary for truth. That truth contains all contradictions simultaneously. So that this is what I've been learning lately. So that, say, black, like the wall is black. So you say, it's a fact, the wall is black. Well, if you try to constrain that statement that the wall is black, but the black contains the notions of white and every other color in order to be black. So there is no black without white. There is no good without evil. There is no something without nothing. So there is like one truth necessarily contains its opposite in order to exist, in order to distinguish itself from other truths or non-truths. But to say, I wouldn't even call them truths or non-truths, I would just say that existent things that exist, like black and white. Black is not a truth. If the word black, or the concept of black, it's not true or false. The concept of white is not true or false. But they necessarily exist. One cannot exist without the other. It's not, or maybe it is enclosed, but it's a necessary. It's a necessity, though, in order to exist as a truth or falsity. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think that's
I don't know.
I think that's a good place to close.
All right. Hey, so, man, thanks for, coming, talking. And is there something that you want to promote? You want to talk about your books?
Yeah, well, I've got this book. We talked about it, Garcia and Meditations. We didn't get to, maybe another time we'll do. We didn't talk about the video game stuff. But
philosophy of video games?
Yeah, that's a book I edited with Mark Silcox, which is pretty good. I've also, with my friend Mark Silcox, the book Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy, the first book by that title, which is Open Chord Press, we did that. So there's fun. I mean, philosophy is everywhere. And I'm translating right now with Christopher Ray Alexander and Abigail Ray Alexander another book, The Life Intense, another book by Tristan Garcia. The first one is Form and Object, which and I'll be writing a book on Graham Harman as well, who we talked about. But yeah, if I want to promote something, I guess it would be the Garcia and Meditations, which we talked about a lot. So
is that out
cool.
already?
Yeah, that's out.
Oh, okay,
cool. That's been out for just a couple months. But
wow,
yeah.
Oh man, that's awesome.
So
that's super awesome.
Yeah, University of Edinburgh Press. So it would be cool stuff. And thanks for having me on, man. This is a wonderful conversation, as it always is.
Yeah.
It's weird to have one of our talks like it'll be out there in the ether. So cool.
And we'll have to do this again for sure.
Definitely.
I have a whole list of stuff we didn't talk about, so we have to do it again.
That's after you start with the first question, and then you're in the rabbit hole, and we traversed it. So
hey, man, that's.
But I think there was an organic unity, just as. Let's close with your three rules, because that's what I want to think about. Eternity in each moment.
Eternity in
divinity in every particle, every entity, and eternity, divinity, organism.
So there is eternity in every moment, divinity in every particle, because everything is made of energy and vibration, and that all is one organism.
All is one organism.
And if all is one organism, then if you are part of the organism and you try to separate yourself from the organism, it will always fail. And so to realize that all is one, but not only all is one, but to go further than that all is one organism, because all is one organism means that everything has to everything is interconnected, interdependent.
See, but we could do this forever. Let's end with the beauty of the propositions. Okay.
All right.
One.
Yeah.
No, do one. Everything is. Every moment is eternal.
There is eternity in every moment.
There's eternity in every moment.
There's divinity in every particle, and that all is one organism.
Q.
And check out my book, Eternal Conversations. Yes. The link is down below. Check out eternalconversations.com. Check out the Eternal Conversations podcast. And peace, love, and light.